Can the Catholic faith and modern psychology work together to promote healing, peace, and spiritual growth in our communities? Or are they at odds? When I speak, I make a point to remind my audiences that they have no reason to trust me, but that trust has to be built over time with me and anyone else they encounter. Sometimes, especially with Catholic audiences, I make the joke that for some of them, by virtue of me being a psychologist, they probably have several reasons not to trust me. Hi, my name is Dr. Julia, a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in the intersection of faith, sexuality, and gender. I'm so glad you're here. Often in our Catholic context, we feel suspicious of psychology, given that so many psychological theories are rooted in non-theistic, materialistic, and postmodern understandings of the person. It's no surprise that to many of us, key figures over the course of psychological history, people like Sigmund Freud, Ivan Pavlov, and John Watson, were not Christians. Some of them saw spirituality and religion as something to be rejected outright, pathologized, or ignored. At the same time, other figures like Carl Jung and Alfred Adler had a value for religion and spirituality and honored the benefits of spiritual inquiry. For Jung, religious experience and the divine could be thought of as symbolic of realities found in the depths of the human psyche. For Adler, religion was a valuable pathway for meaning, purpose, and belonging. Still, there are few models of key psychological figures who deeply subscribe to Christian faith. This often makes it hard for Catholics to trust the contributions of modern psychology. You may be wondering, how can psychology and Catholic faith work together? Our Catholic faith is incredible in that in our tradition, faith and reason are not pitted against each other as opposites, but rather the integration of faith and reason is actually the path for understanding reality. Over the course of human history, many Catholics have spearheaded meaningful contributions to the natural and social sciences. At the same time, Catholics can feel hesitant to receive care from the disciplines in the natural and social sciences, often out of fear of the ways these modes of knowledge are limited. It seems Catholics worry that gleaning the truths that flow from the sciences could lead us to believe that these avenues, and not God, will save us. And to be sure, there are ways that psychology can slice out spiritual realities. There is no shortage of examples of this any one of us could draw from. And yet, it's worth remembering that psychology actually comes from the Greek word psyche, which means soul or spirit. Psychology then literally means the study of the soul. This implies that there is more than the body here. As Catholics, we understand that each person is a body-soul unity. Each of us is a body, as well as a spiritual being. Psychology at its best accounts for the person in this type of holistic way. And psychology is a discipline that allows us to learn how to better attune to some fundamental aspects of our humanity, our thoughts, our feelings, our motivations, our behaviors, our strengths, and our limitations. Psychology at its best doesn't negate the spiritual, but removes what could hinder us from seeing the spiritual realities within us and outside of us. Too often, I get the question, why would faithful Catholics need therapy at all? Can't we just turn to God and have Him bring about the healing we so desperately long for? Mental health concerns seem to flow out from the consequences of a fallen world that we find ourselves in. This reality as we encounter it today is not how it was originally meant to be. After the fall, we're born into families and communities where limited people hurt us. We must navigate experiences that aren't God's best for us. Things are not part of God's active will, and they sometimes happen in and around us. These things can cause immense suffering of body and soul. Mental health concerns, things like depression, anxiety, and any other number of challenges in this realm emerge, in some sense, actually as a way to manage and cope with the reality of our fallen world. Untreated mental health concerns have the capacity to obstruct our view of ourselves and others. They can also confound our ability to encounter God as He actually is. Thankfully, there are methods available in psychology to remove some of the barriers that can obstruct our view. Every good thing comes from God, including any manner of healing we experience in this life. So in a very real sense, therapy is actually one of the ways we can turn towards God as the ultimate healer and invite Him to heal us in and through the discipline of psychology. Much in the same way as we would see a faithful Catholic going to a medical doctor to treat their cancer as clearly honoring the dignity of their body and soul, we can see a faithful Catholic going to see a therapist to address their depression as an equally important way of honoring their dignity as a child of God. Let's take the example of a Catholic young man who struggles with panic attacks and immense shame about ongoing struggles with lust. Perhaps his anxiety often leads him to doubt that he is ever really forgiven by God for his sins and weaknesses. Perhaps he finds himself unable to offer compassion to others when they fall short of God's best too, because it can be very difficult to give to others compassion when we have not yet received it ourselves. Practices of self-compassion in therapy can then be instrumental in expanding that young man's ability to see himself as God sees him and receive the mercy of God in ways that open him up to offer that mercy to others more freely and fully. A range of therapies can help this young man and each one of us remove some of the barriers that get in the way of spiritual growth and wholeness. You may be thinking now about the barriers that you bump up against in your own life, and you may be wondering, how can we remove these barriers in therapy? There are a lot of different ways to think about this, but I'll share a bit about how I understand therapy helping. We can begin first by becoming aware of these barriers. This involves identifying the mental health symptoms that are difficult for us to manage. To do this, with a therapist, we start to learn language to communicate our thoughts, our feelings, and our symptoms, both to ourselves and to others. Sometimes this brings about clarity about a diagnosis that we felt alone in experiencing. This answers the question, what am I struggling with? Then, in the context of a real relationship with a real person, a therapist, we begin to learn more about how our specific symptoms show up for us uniquely. Inevitably, the symptoms that push us around in daily life arise in therapy. This is when we start to cultivate curiosity. We ask questions like, what am I noticing? What's happening for me? When the thoughts, feelings, and symptoms come up. These questions themselves help our brains to regulate us in the face of difficult emotions. Then, in offering validation, support, compassion, awareness, and grace to these places, we can come to deeper understandings that allow us to overcome barriers that have been there for so long. Over time, in this type of dialogue with ourselves in the presence of another, we gradually build a relationship with ourselves, God, and others, where the various barriers no longer is obstructing. What was once a barrier becomes a place of insight, clarity, compassion, connection, courage, and so much more. What can one hope for in therapy? What's the actual goal? So often, people will ask me, is the goal of therapy that the pain goes away? Maybe for you, you've gone to therapy, and at the start of it, the pain actually got worse. There is truth to that. For many people, one of the hopes of going to therapy is that we'll feel better, right? That maybe I'll stop feeling negative emotion, anger, depression, fear, disgust, and start feeling more positive emotion, things like joy, peace, and calm. In my work with clients, I remind them that the goal is actually being willing and able to move through the full range of human emotions safely. We do this imperfectly as humans, but over time, we can grow in our tolerance for the full range of our emotional lives. Therapy doesn't make pain go away completely, but it can change our relationship with suffering and pain in life, where suffering actually becomes an avenue for wisdom, growth, connection, compassion, and deep spiritual insight, not a sign of my own deficiency. This transmutes suffering into something redemptive, which gets at the very heart of the Paschal mystery. I've often been asked, what is it that I hope for when people go to therapy? Of course, I love when people are less debilitated by things like depression, paralyzed by anxiety when they end therapy. I expect them to experience a reduction of many of their symptoms, and I also expect them to be able to take risks, do things that terrify them when needed in life. I expect them to be able to step into relationships with boundaries, greater confidence, assertiveness, vulnerability, and love. I want them to embody greater courage, clarity, connection, compassion, and hope in the midst of the world that is both darkness and light. And as a Catholic psychologist, of course, I want more than psychological health for them. As an undergraduate theology professor of mine, Michael Dalfinay, recently pointed out to me in a conversation, in quote, "We want more than psychological health for a person, but not less," end quote. The question becomes, what makes the more than that more accessible? Experiencing the more than that can come through a certain level of mental wellness. Therapy, then, can help with removing barriers that obstruct our ability to know ourselves, know God, and others more fully. Therapy is a gift God has given us to help us in the here and now become more fully who we're called to be. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you're listening and you've been waiting for an encouragement to go to therapy, this is it. Therapy is a place where you can grow in confidence, courage, and a life of holiness in and through psychology. If you're interested in following more of my work, my name is Dr. Julia, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist working at the intersection of faith, sexuality, and gender. If you want to follow more lectures or more content related to what you saw here, take a look at my Patreon for more.